Welcome to part 2 of my podcast on the Russo-Ukrainian War. In this episode, let's continue where we left off. In Moscow at around 4 in the morning, President Putin announced the commencement of what he called a special military operation in the Donbas region of Ukraine, with explosions and bombings taking place all across Ukraine. Not long after, explosions were reported in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and the Donbas. Ukraine officials reported Russian troops landing in Mariupol and Odessa and that they launched cruise and ballistic missiles at airfields, military headquarters, and depots in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Dnipro. Military vehicles entered Ukraine through Belarus, Russia, and Russian-annexed Crimea in the morning. The US said it believed that Russia intended to decapitate Ukraine's government and install a pro-Russian one, with Putin announcing that he was seeking the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. US intelligence officials believed that Kyiv would fall within 96 hours, however 1 week and 3 days later, and Kyiv is still under the control of Ukraine. After a full day of fighting and countless bombings which have resulted in Kyiv metro stations being used as bomb shelters, fighting erupted in Chernobyl and Pripyat at around 4 p.m. Russia claimed their aim was to capture the decommissioned nuclear power plant in order to prevent accidents during bombings and attacks, and by 6:20 p.m. it was under their control. At around 10 p.m. it was announced that Russian forces had captured Snake Island following naval and air bombardments of the 0.17 kilometer squared island. An audio clip went viral of 2 Russian naval ships ordering the Ukrainian soldiers to surrender, with them replying, "Russian warship, go yourself." It was believed that all 13 border guards on the island had been killed, but after President Zelensky posthumously awarded them with the Hero of Ukraine award, the Ukrainian border guard announced on the 26th of February that the 13 personnel may still be alive. Around 11 p.m., President Zelensky ordered a general mobilization of all Ukrainian males between 18 and 60 years old, and as a result, that group of people were restricted from fleeing Ukraine. On the first day of the crisis, countries have already begun to impose sanctions for what the European Council referred to as their unprovoked and unjustified military aggression towards Ukraine. The US bans 5 more Russian banks from the US financial system and freezes 4 of the 5 banks US held access. Trade in the debt and equity of 13 banks and state-owned enterprises is also banned in the US. As a result of the collective sanctions towards them, Moscow's stock exchange plummeted by 45%, a figure which is unprecedented. The next day, Russia continued to advance on the capital city of Kyiv, and the European Union agreed to sanction Putin and Lavrov, and Russia vetoed a UN Security Council resolution which demanded for them to withdraw their military from Ukraine. On February 26th, the US offered to evacuate President Zelensky and senior government figures, but he refused, saying that he would stay and fight. After the invasion, more and more sanctions were placed on Russia. Back on the 24th of February, Formula One suspended their contract for the Russian Grand Prix, a contract which was later terminated. On the 25th, Russia was banned from the Eurovision Song Contest. The EU also announced its intention to prevent Russia's central bank from accessing its estimated $630 billion worth of reserves in order to finance the war, a practice which, if successful by Russia, would undermine the effectiveness of economic sanctions. Russia was then cut out of the global financial system as they were banned from SWIFT. Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund announced it would pull out all of its 47 Russian investments, which are worth $2.8 billion. Major oil company BP announced it would withdraw from an almost 20% stake in Russia's state oil giant Rosneft, an investment valued at $14 billion and making up around half of BP's oil and gas reserves. Still, by the 28th of February, despite feeling the effects of the sanctions and the ruble falling 30%, Russia continued its invasion and fight against Ukraine. On March 1st, a 65-kilometer-long Russian convoy began to build up on the outskirts of Kyiv, but 3 days later it had barely moved at all. This could be down to a number of reasons. Former commander of the United Kingdom's Joint Forces Command, General Sir Richard Barrons, told BBC Radio 4's Today programme there's a massive logistical failure to provide fuel, food, spare parts and tyres. They got stuck in the mud in a way that makes it difficult to move vehicles out. Moving on, Human Rights Watch reports that Russians are using cluster bombs against civilians. Cluster bombs are a type of anti-personnel munition which deploy a large number of explosives, small in size, over a large area. They are effective in causing a large number of casualties at once and were banned in a treaty called the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Ukrainian officials also accused Russia of targeting a television tower in Kyiv. Most importantly, Ukrainians and people all around the world were outraged that the attack that killed 5 people took place in the vicinity of the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial on the site of the World War II massacre in which the Nazis murdered more than 30,000 Ukrainian Jews. With regards to the incident, President Zelensky tweeted, "To the world, what is the point of saying never again for 80 years if the world stays silent when a bomb drops on the same site of Babin Yar? At least 5 killed. History repeating." On the 2nd of March, the UN General Assembly approved a non-binding resolution which condemned Russia for its invasion of Ukraine and demanded for an immediate withdrawal. The resolution was supported by 141 out of 193 members, apart from key states like China and India and others who abstained from the vote. That day, Russia claimed it had captured Kherson, a port city on the southern coast of Ukraine, which is home to at least 300,000 people, although local authorities deny the city has fallen to Russian troops, but do admit that Russian troops have surrounded it. By this time, the United Nations records that in excess of 870,000 people have fled Ukraine since the inception of the invasion. According to US officials, by the 28th of February, Ukraine had 1,500 soldiers killed, and according to Russia, by the 2nd of March, 2,870 Ukrainian soldiers had been killed. Meanwhile, according to US officials, by the 28th of February, Russia had suffered between 2,000 and 3,000 soldiers killed, with Russia themselves claiming to have lost 498 soldiers by the 2nd of March. Thank you for listening to this episode of my podcast. The next episode will resume from after the 3rd of March and will be released within a week's time. Sources for this episode include Al Jazeera, BBC News, The Washington Post, and Sky News. Thank you for listening to this episode of my podcast. Please subscribe to be notified when the next episodes are released. Share this episode with your friends and family in order to spread more awareness regarding what is happening in Ukraine. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.